To our council meeting for the 10th of February, 2025, where we're discussing the annual plan. We will start with KARAKIA.
Morning, councillors. Whakatakata hou ki te uru, whakatakata hou ki te tonga, ki makina kina ki uta, ki mataratara ki tai, e he aka ana te arakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Chief Executive. I hope everybody had a nice long weekend and got to enjoy some of the sun. All right, we've got a big document. We've got 2 days set aside for this. If we are able to knock it out in one day, that would be fantastic. So we'll try and make as diligent a work out of this as we can. All right, health and safety. No changes to that health and safety, and I don't see any new participants in the room, so we'll take that as read. We'll go to apologies. We've got apologies from Councillor Hodge for absence today. Do I have a mover to accept Councillor Smith and a second in Councillor Strange? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Now, confirmation of the agenda. So the agenda is on page 3 of your document. We do possibly have a late item that might need to be added. We received a letter from Minister Bishop regarding WRC's appointment to the River Authority. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, councillors, last Wednesday, the chair received a letter from Minister Bishop saying that we requesting a nomination, a regional council nomination for the Waikato River Authority, because Stu Kneebone is the current incumbent. The term finishes in May 2025. Now, very generously, they gave us until February the 19th to make that nomination, which makes life a little bit awkward. I've contacted the Chief Executive of MFE today and asked him to find out urgently whether we can delay that until the council meeting on the 27th of February. Depending on what they come back with, is whether we might have to add a late agenda item to this meeting. But I'm hopeful that they will say, given that the current term is until May, I'm hopeful that they'll say that's okay. But I'll keep in contact with MFE.
Yeah. So just a heads up that may be on our plate for today as well. Okay. Do I have a mover for the agenda? Councillor Kneebone, a second, Councillor Strange. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Disclosures of interest. Any new disclosures or disclosures in relation to items in front of us today? Nope. Okay, so we will move on to item 7.1, our proposed 2025-26 annual plan. You're gonna open?
Yep. Councillors, if I could just make a very brief comment. I mean, obviously this follows our the workshop that we had in December, where we took to you what we saw that the annual plan looking like, and we got the feedback from that. The items in here incorporate all that feedback. There has most of you, hopefully all of you, saw the email I sent out last night with respect to discussion around rating impacts. We have been through a long-term plan process which set the budgets for 3 years, and we're only really talking about any material departures from that budget. Janine, you might like to add just at the start what audit New Zealand's expectations are. I don't know if we've had any final view on it, but we're not sure that they need to even audit at this stage, subject to discussions today, what we're putting forward. I guess that what they're seeing is that the matters for consultation aren't sufficiently significant to warrant an audit at this stage, but we need confirmation of that. You might like to talk to that as well, Janine. But any other material departures, we'd need to consider that as we go through. Madam Chair.
Kia ora. Oh, and just so councillors know, we've got Councillor Mahuta online and Councillor Graf.
Aroha mai.
Kia ora. Janine.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, councillors. Great to see you again for the year. Always good to start off with an annual plan budget meeting for the year.
A little bit closer. There we go.
So as Chris has said, the material in front of you is really based off the workshop that we held with you on the 10th of December last year, with some of those new items and the moving parts, and from a plan perspective, fleshed out, more detail provided on those. But I'll just start, I guess, with the usual scene setting, run through some of the key budget assumptions, and then my colleagues will jump in with discussions on key changes to the budget, new business cases that are presented for council consideration, and we can see how the day goes. Nice. So next slide, thanks, Dave.
Oh, yes. Councillor Nebon.
Just a question / refresh, please. Obviously, there's been a few emails shared around. Just want to, if we could refresh our understanding of the processes. My understanding is, just for argument's sake, and I'm not going to agree with Chris Hughes, but if we go out with zero rates, we effectively cut a whole bunch of stuff out of our work program. We can't put that back in because we haven't consulted on it, because we're basically cupping it. Is that correct? I'm just making sure we're all on the same page. If we go out with a bunch of stuff, we can then, as a result of community feedback, cut a whole bunch of that if we so decide, following the feedback from our submissions. But if we cut a whole bunch of stuff now, we can't put it back in unless we consult on it. Consult to put it back in.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Nebon. Through the chair, as Chris laid out, our planning and decision-making process is really underpinned by the LTP. Council and staff spend a lot of time carefully considering that plan, which should lay the foundations for a 3-year cycle. To vary anything significantly from that would require us to go back and reconsult with the community in terms of key changes and levels of service that weren't contemplated through the LTP. And that would also be a trigger, if we're amending our LTP, for an audit. And I would hazard a guess that that audit process would be of the same sort of scale as we see for an LTP if we were to substantially change. I guess the challenge is that in making some of those decisions within an annual plan cycle is what's the consequence of that for subsequent years as well, whereas the LTP is actually considering that longer term view of council's plans and priorities. I think just to clarify in terms of Chris's comment around the need for an audit for what is proposed here, staff sought independent legal advice and that confirmed the view that in audit we're asking us had we taken that advice, so they will be relying heavily on that themselves. There's nothing in terms of the proposals in front of us that would trigger the need for an audit, so we're not really amending the LTP. They're all decisions that were contemplated within that process. So while we need to consult, the need for consultation is not the same as the need for an audit. So Our timelines at the moment are based on no audit being required, based on what's proposed and presented to you today.
All right, I've got Councillor Graff online and then Councillor Hughes. Councillor Graff.
Oh, thank you very much. So just taking into account what Stu said and also what Janine just said, once public consultation takes place, is there any room to be able to tweak some numbers following public consultation, just like Stu mentioned, or are we pretty well locked in, Janine?
Through the chair, normally your decision making is limited to those items that you are consulting on, unless of course there's something new from our operating environment that changes. That would mean actually we need to make reflect that within the budget that we actually set for the annual plan, and that final confirmation of the budget always occurs end of June after we've been through the hearings, deliberations process. So it's not a wide open, you've set an annual plan, decided what you're going to consult on through that process, and then you can change a whole lot of things prior to final adoption. You need to make those decisions today.
Thanks.
Councillor Hughes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Everyone will be aware in this room that there are going to be some directives coming out from Wellington which are going to be quite clear to local bodies as to what the expectations are, how they must control their rates in future, and the work programs, services that they deliver to their ratepayer community. And that will be to stick to the basics. They're taking away the 4 pillars. Anything to do with that is to disappear. And so we will be paring things back to basics. Now, I would have liked to have thought that we could have been a trendsetter and be ahead of the pack on that. We know it's coming, and it's a question of when. All we're doing is delaying it for 12 months. And as I said in my email to councillors, I believe it's possible that we could end up with a rate bill this year which will reflect the expectation of the current government, which is not more than the level of inflation. And we could do better because we've got a surplus carried forward which could be offset against the costs. There are changes which they've imposed on us. For example, increasing the level of charge for passengers on transport, which means that the ratepayer gets the benefit of that. It's a user pays principle, and I'm absolutely 100% with that. Our chief executive in his response, and thank you for that, Chris, indicated that if we'd given that direction in December at our last meeting, then there was a possibility that, if I'm reading this correctly, those objectives could be met. There are things in the regional council's work programs which could be pruned. Now, we're not asking for that to be done at this stage, but I am asking that we show prudence in terms of what we do approve and that we make a target of less than what we had in our annual plan. And if it means going to audit, so be it. For a cost of 140 grand or whatever it is the auditors charge, and Janine can tell us the rough figure, we're doing our ratepayers a service by making sure that we are being prudent in terms of that expenditure, which we are committing to our ratepayers for the next 12 months. Thank you.
Just wanting to clarify, it sounds as though the interpretation of the chief executive's email is that had the direction been in December, the direction from majority of council to investigate a 0 rate rise, it sounds as though you read the chief executive's email as that was indeed possible. I just want to make sure that is that what your email was signaling?
Just to clarify, what I indicated, there was no discussion or mandate at that meeting to look at other options, and what we've brought you today is what the feedback that had been given from councillors at that meeting is what we brought today. I'm not putting any further interpretation on that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Smith.
Thank you. 2 points. And just to come back at Councillor Hughes, inflation, it's very easy to talk about the rate of inflation, which everyone understands, but households buy spuds and toilet paper and all those household goods. Councils don't do that. They buy materials that often comes under the construction cost index, which is much higher than the household inflation costs. So we need to be careful what inflation we're talking about. So we need to differentiate with it. So the question I have is, if we use any of the surplus, will that impact on the need to have an audit? So it's just
I wouldn't believe so.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's continue on.
Thank you. Next slide. Thanks, Dave. So I think we've probably already covered this. As we've stated, this annual plan process is a review of year 2 of the LTP. So it is the opportunity to consider changes in our operating environment since the LTP was adopted and to make provision for new issues and opportunities. Outside of that, the proposed annual plan as presented is in line with the decisions previously made by Council through that LTP process back in that concluded in June last year. Next slide, thanks, Dave. So as is noted in the report, the LTP for 25-26 proposed a total increase in rates revenue of 8.6% from current ratepayers. And there are some key drivers within that, obviously new investment by way of business cases that were considered, the implementation of a regional rating model for public transport from 1st of July this year, as well as an underlying increase in the low cost, low risk program for public transport. Now, in response to some of the questions, I guess that we've seen over the weekend, to clarify the impact of the shift to regional rating on that 8.6%, that would account for about 2% of that. So council's normal business operations would have been impacting or resulting in about a 6.6% increase in revenue from current ratepayers. Next slide, thanks, Dave. The new and emerging external factors that have influenced the development of the annual plan, obviously in relation to the National Land Transport Plan and associated funding, which has resulted in us scaling back any of the new services that were anticipated through the LTP. That was always contingent on being successful in attaining that very important central government funding. So with that not available, that's all been scaled back. There's a pause to freshwater farm plans. The funding that has been secured through the Before the Deluge program and the favourable impact that that has had in terms of our borrowing costs and the need for us to borrow, as well as rapid changes in the official cash rate. Negative from an investment perspective, positive from a borrowing, from the borrowing side. So sitting somewhere in the middle there, but that's definitely been a rapidly moving factor for us. Next slide, thanks, Dave. Oh, the font gets smaller now. So against that backdrop of the 8.6% included in the LTP, the revised annual plan presented as the basis for the report that's in front of you reflected an increase in total rates revenue from current ratepayers of 6.2%. Now, of that increase and of the revised increase, should council support the recommendations that staff have put up, the inclusion of transport rating regionally would represent about a 1.5% increase in rates. So your 6.2 becomes 4.7, at 5.8, 4.3 in terms of all other things being equal. That's what the change in total rates revenue would be. And so up there are the key issues that are set out within the report, with recommendations, obviously from staff in relation to those. If all of those matters are taken into account, then we land at that 5.8% increase in total rates revenue from ratepayers. Next slide, thanks, Dave.
So, sorry, that 5.8. So the contribution that the PT makes to that 5.8 again?
1.5. Yeah. It was about 2% in the LTP, but that was with it was with an expanded low cost, low risk program that was always contingent on having NZTA match funding for that, which the NLTF has obviously reduced what's available in that regard.
If I could just make a comment, just to reiterate, make sure everybody understands that if it was 6.2 or 5.8%, the impact on the ratepayer on the region, that the 1.5% we pick up should come off the district's bill. So that will be neutral. So that 1.5% isn't adding to the ratepayers. It's what they.
Asking our TAs to show a line item on their budget so that the communities can see that it's been taken off, even though they're likely to have a much higher because of Three Waters.
So those of us that share meet the candidate meetings with our TA counterparts will no doubt bring that up.
I think it was a point definitely through the LTP audit that Audit New Zealand were seeking that assurance that there was actually an offset there. Obviously, we can't influence the setting of those TA budgets, but that's the intent. We might skip over this one, Dave.
Sorry, could I just clarify? You're going to ask Audit New Zealand to review other councils to make sure they.
No, it's through the LTP process. We were being asked to ensure that there was that communication in place and a signal from those territorial authorities that yes, they would be doing that. But obviously for them, they're going through the same processes now. I'm sure they've got a lot of other factors where how clear and transparent that will be is outside of our control.
Sorry, Madam Chair and Janine, if I could just to re-emphasise, I'm sure everybody's worked it out, but just to re-emphasise that considering that transfer, that the WRC rates, we're talking about a 4.3 or a 4.8% increase plus the transfer of the rates in the districts.
In terms of, it's all very well to talk percentages, and as I will always say, there's never an average ratepayer in the region. So, the distribution of how this impacts will be very variable based on where people are living, the services they receive, the value of their property, a whole bunch of things. But if we look at this, so these numbers are based on the 6.2% increase in rates revenue in terms of the median rates by territorial authority, current and then what's proposed. You can get a sense of where key shifts are lying, but the total increase to the ratepayer of what this budget would mean. I've called out there's a number of our territorial authority partners who are revaluing this year. None of that has actually landed yet. That will have an impact on the distribution of particularly the general rate and biosecurity rate across the region, as well as obviously the distribution of rates within those territorial authority areas, depending on the valuation movements.
So just on that issue, Waikato District revalued last year. So does that affect why it's 18% there?
So through the chair, no, I think if you look at the information, the supplementary information that was shared with councillors, I think on Wednesday, which did the rating impacts by territorial authority, when you look at Waikato and Waipa in particular, that is the regional rating for the public transport services that they receive is actually a key element of that. those councils are obviously paying for those services at the moment, but not on our rates bill. They're paying, this is they're paying through their rates. So, yeah, it was, and the graphs are in this presentation if we want to look at those. I wasn't intending to go through that in detail, but if you look at the revenue from each TA, you could see a new little line popping up, which was transport. And so those two areas in particular are the increases are as a result of the regional rating for public transport.
Councillor Marr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Janine, just a question, and no doubt we're going to get to what goes out in the consultation document, but personally, I don't like to see anything like this. It is misleading around a median rate and what that means, etc. So that just that point of view. And secondly, we spoke earlier about the extremely large reserve that we've ended up with, and or the my concern. Sorry, not reserves.
The prior surplus.
Yeah, surplus. Sorry. Have we analysed the drivers behind that and recognised that they are not in the 25-26 rating?
Yeah, so through the chair, when I had reported that position to the Finance and Services Committee, I had included in that the key drivers and what we'd done through the planning process to look at those and ensure that we'd actually corrected for them with where the factors within our control, obviously, that we had definitely taken all of those into consideration when we were setting this budget.
Thank you.
So if we move on to the next slide, Dave, and I guess this is the the bottom of that one's chopped off, but you have been provided with those. This shows that distribution of change in rates in dollars at the top and as a percentage at the bottom. And so what this is indicating across the region is that for about 2/3 of our ratepayers, the increase would be less than $50 a year. For 90% of our ratepayers, it would be less than $100 a year. But you can see that spike in that sort of $20 to $50 range, which is influenced by the regional rating of public transport coming in there. Okay, so move on. So I can go through these reasonably quickly. These are just the key financial planning assumptions that underpin the budget. Obviously inflation, and noting that inflation's already been a little bit of a topic of conversation this morning. We've called out their specific, wind back. When we are preparing the long-term plan, we are required to reflect our best estimate of future costs. And so to do that, we inflation proof or inflation adjust all of our numbers moving forward. When we come to do the annual plan, we actually strip that inflation out so that we're using baseline pre-inflation numbers for the annual plan. And then on top of that, staff are asked to make specific provision for inflation where there's a contractual need for it or other driver of inflation. And so those specific provisions that are included in the budget are set out there. And included in the numbers. I've added a commentary at the bottom of this slide in response to, I guess, some of the comments around needing to bring the budget back to CPI. And so as at December 2024, year on year CPI was 2.2%. But from Council's operations, and it's the point that Councillor Smith raised, a lot of our costs are not driven by CPI. That's a basket of goods and services to households. They're not business expenditures. If we look at our public transport costs, the indexation or inflation provisions on those is 6.4%. And for staff salaries, based on the market information as at September last year, we've got 3.9% included in those. Now, those two cost areas alone account for 48% of council's operating costs. So taking that into account to get back to a 2.2 means that you would have to make some reductions, significant reductions in other areas to be able to get close to that sort of movement. So I just thought useful context in terms of understanding that there are other market drivers that are actually influencing the way that our costs move, that are outside of a reference to CPI as a measure of a basket of household goods and services.
Councillor Hughes.
Oh, thanks, Madam Chair. Just a couple of points, if I may, Janine. Knowing that we've got contract negotiations coming up with our transport providers, I just wonder how sensible it is to be advertising what we're expecting to have to pay them by way of increases. Like, this is all publicly available information, and if I was going into negotiations, I certainly wouldn't be signalling to them what I expected to be paying as an increase. In fact, I'd be signalling the opposite. As far as salaries are concerned, and I know we've discussed this earlier, but the indications I've had is that the figure will be 2%, and that's in line with inflation. So I know you're going to be making those adjustments when it's become available, but just putting it into perspective, 2% is not too far away from realism in some areas. So.
If I can perhaps just respond, and Phil might want to as well, in terms of the public transport costs. So that rate is an NZTA published indexation movement. So I'm pretty sure that's probably reasonably widely available. Our contracts require us to adjust contract values in line with that. I think the renegotiation or recontracting of services will be through a full open procurement process, not impacting on this financial year though.
I've already addressed, thank you for that, but I have addressed my suggestions as to how New Zealand Inc. should be taking on Go Bus in terms of their negotiations, but that's up to those involved. Thanks.
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just two things. One, the 690,000 for software higher than we predicted. Any explanation of why that is so high?
Through the Chair, I understand that was possibly an omission from the LTP budget in terms of some of those price escalations. On our software, which is generally software as a service, there is always an inflation adjustment that's required to those contract costs, to those costs, sorry.
So obviously our software overall costs are significant if 690,000 is more than what we, yeah. Okay, thank you.
So salary information, probably already covered that largely. So based on the advice that we take from strategic pay, is at the 30th of September, market movement was at that point in time 3.9%. We receive two sets of market data every year. So September in terms of setting the budget, and then again based on March in terms of determining actual staff remuneration movements that would be applied effective 1st of July for the year. And just noting in terms of salaries for new roles, which all new roles are as per the LTP. We assume that we have those new bods in place from the 1st of July, but the salary for each role is only based on 95% of the applicable band.
Councillor Graf, have you got a question?
Oh, yes, there was something I wanted to just ask on 7.1 and then 8.b, freshwater farm plans, the pausing of them, the word pause, is there an intention to reopen those or are they cancelled? And Sorry, I can't hear anyone.
Sorry,
there.
we're just
Yep,
getting
we're
just
just-
getting Brent to respond.
Getting a
Oh,
mic.
okay, thanks. Sorry. Yeah.
So your question, Clyde's about the national regs.
Yeah, just with on what page is it there? The pause to freshwater farm plans. Is there an impact on rates in regard to that either way? And was that a targeted rate?
So it's a mixture, Clyde, of both targeted rate to the property owners that are subject to the regulations and general rate. So it's a mixture of funding sources. So the government is likely to announce in the very near future the changes that it sees to the freshwater farm planning regs. Some of those changes will need to be, they'll need legislative change that comes through the middle of the year, which will probably come through with Bill 2. So what you're seeing in the finances is a delay on spend, whilst there is some uncertainty about what things will ultimately look like there.
Okay.
The government's made it clear that there will be a freshwater farm planning regime. It'll be a little bit different than what it currently is. And so, so the spend then is delayed because we will still need to do something. It's just exactly how much and when is the question.
Thank you, Brent. Just while we're on salaries, etc., for new roles, was I right in reading the 9.5 FTEs, new 9.5 staff members?
Yes, that's correct, as per the long-term plan.
Yep. Okay. Just okay. I just had a bit of concern about that, but obviously, I mean, it was all discussed. But I've had a fairly up and down, year. So, been a bit fogged out a lot actually with regard to family issues. So if you could just get back to me perhaps on those FTEs again, or and any case, I'm a bit concerned about the cost of the new 9.5 FTEs. So if we could address that, that'd be great. Thanks.
So Janine, we're not saying those additional staff in relation to this annual plan, right? Those were the additional staff that came out of the long-term plan process, right?
So you're talking about it over the long term, over the 10-year period or 3-year period, is it?
No, so through the chair, there are an additional 9.5 FTEs that were approved to come on board in 25-26 through the decisions made in the LTP. So those would have all been covered by business cases for new investment that council considered and signed off on.
Yeah, I didn't actually
funded.
agree to it, but yeah, I didn't agree to that. Okay, so do we get an opportunity to actually look at those again, or are they pretty well locked in?
I think to revisit the FTEs, you would be revisiting the business cases that were put forward and the planned work. So I don't think you can you cannot look at those FTEs in isolation of the other costs and the planned work that they were going to deliver. Not approving those would obviously have an impact on what we're able to do.
I think, Councillor Graf, there's a table on page 36 which talks about the FTEs, and you'll be able to work out from that where they're coming. Of course, some will require rate funding and some might not, because there might be revenue associated with them. So you can't just assume that they're all costs.
Right.
And they're all related to, as has been discussed, that services, I think in some cases that council were quite keen in the LTP to add to the business.
Thank you.
Councillor Marr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Janine, if I can just jump back to Ben's and that 690,000 for software, is that the same as the 684,000 on page 32, which is information services budget to meet contractual inflation? It's the same. It's a slightly different figure, but is that?
I'd need to check whether they are different or exactly the same. I've got David here. Same number.
Same thing. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, next slide,
Carry
thanks,
on.
Dave. So just in terms of treasury functions, so investment income, obviously council went through a thorough process as part of the LTP to review investment strategy, investment returns and so on. So the fund return is forecast, total fund return is forecast at just over 7 million. The rate subsidy portion of that is just under 2 million. That is all in line with what was provided for in the LTP. In terms of interest income, say we've tried to reflect in here the various movements in the official cash rate that have occurred up until November 2024. So that's resulted in a reduction from what we had in the LTP and what we achieved in the last financial year as well. And then the flip side to that, of course, is the interest expense, particularly on our borrowing. So while we've taken a hit in terms of our working capital funds, in terms of our borrowing program, this is obviously favourable. And so we take long-term advice on this from PwC, and that's resulted in that revision to the interest cost on borrowing. In addition to that reduction in the OCR, obviously we've been fortunate under the Before the Deluge program to receive funding in relation to our capital program as well. So that has reduced the amount of borrowing that we're required to undertake for the year, which has a flow-on impact in terms of the interest cost. So we've provided a breakdown there in terms of those two different mechanisms and the impact that they're having on the total interest that we've budgeted for in 25-26 versus the LTP.
Councillor Hughes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Janine, just on the rate subsidy, is that not inflation adjusted? It was.
Yes, it is.
It is?
So it was so we had a baseline figure of 1.9 this year.
Okay, so thanks. Yeah, it's my understanding.
Yep. Next one, thanks, Dave. And then insurance costs. So while our recent renewal has actually been quite favourable in terms of achieving increased cover for a reduced premium, particularly in relation to our infrastructure cover, there has been the need to adjust the budget that we hold for that. So an increase in our total insurance costs of 138,000. And then just noting in terms of regional growth, we have currently assuming a continuation of that 1.5% increase in the number of properties from growth across the region.
1.5 increase in properties doesn't correlate to 1.5% in rates collected, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So what does that equate to?
Well, we use it to increase our per property charges. So things, the Natural Heritage Fund used to increase, the revenue would increase by the 1.5. The way that we use it is the calculation of the total revenue that we collect. We reduce that percentage by the 1.5%, saying that 1.5% will be covered by new properties or new ratepayers who aren't currently contributing to the cost of our services.
Just wanted to make the point that 1.5% growth does not mean 1.5% increase in rates.
No, so it's not. We don't increase all of our rates by 1.5% because of growth, but we recognise that there are new ratepayers coming into the region who will contribute to our expenditure. Our rates revenue requirement is solely driven off the expenditure that's planned and our funding policies.
Councillor Hughes.
Can I ask what the 1.5% then translates to into dollar rates collected, expected to be collected?
So about 2.2 million.
which represents what percentage of the total?
Sorry,
Which represents what percentage of the total?
which percentage?
Of the free 1.5, take the 2.2 out, what percentage of the total rates does that represent?
1.5%.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Thank you. That answers my question.
So, but I think Councillor Smith's comment was that we don't increase our rates revenue by 1.5% just because of growth. We communicate our increase in rates reflecting that growth effectively. That was the point, I think, yeah.
Sorry, just, I got more confused now. I thought he was saying there was a 1.5 increase in new properties, but it's not, is it?
Yes,
But I just thought you
That's
said
what
the
we're assuming.
2.2 million was 1% of.
yep. That's the maths. Okay, we'll move on. So in terms of balanced budget, there's a resolution included in the report on this matter. Under the Local Government Act, council is required to consider those activities where operating expenditures don't meet operating expenses. Say that right? Revenues don't meet expenses. And where they don't, resolving that is financially prudent to do so, to have that unbalanced budget. So in presenting this plan, the budget isn't fully balanced for reasons that are set out in the report. They are in accordance with the decisions that were made through the LTP, at which point you resolved that was a financially prudent position to take. So just wanted to highlight that because that is a resolution that you will need to pass.
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Madam Chair. Just to clarify, so we have a budget surplus at the moment. We have, of what amount?
So I can come on to that right now if you like.
Okay, well, and the question is, when we end up with, assuming we're at 6.2%, how much of that budget surplus is left?
I can cover that off right now. So next slides. In terms of the prior year surplus, what we have reported to you previously is an available surplus of just over $6 million. To date, you have approved a series of items. So up to 100,000 to inform regional development activities that was approved in September. But I think there has been subsequent discussion, I think in December at the workshop, around the opportunity to potentially move that instead to be funded through the regional economic, from the residual regional development fund. Sorry, shouldn't have economic in there. That would require a new resolution from council though, but we could tidy that up through this process. You've also approved 100,000 to enable preparatory work for navigation safety functions at the Port of Taharoa to be transferred to council. And there was 414,000 of capital expenditure in the current year to manage the impact of council's operations on the spread of the invasive freshwater clam. And at the December workshop, council supported in principle the utilisation of the surplus to address historic costs in relation to freshwater farm plans. Now that number is different to what is included in your report. We've had another look at what's required to balance that out, and that has been reduced. I think we had 1.851 being required in that space. So that's a lesser drawdown on the prior year surplus. So if I'm right, Dave, I've added a slide in here. Nope. So not quite. I'll keep you waiting. One more slide. So having taken account of those other matters, there's 3.94 million available. But there's some other matters within the report to be considered against that surplus. So particularly the business case for process management expertise of 138,000. And at the December workshop, you had signalled interest in looking at that. So that's the discussion for today, although staff have not assumed anything in that space, pending direction from all of you. So now hopefully the next slide has my table in it. So there's your 6.04 million. What's been allocated to give you the 3.94, and I've just italicised that historic freshwater farm plan number that has changed. Off that, so you'd potentially put 100,000 back in if you funded the regional economic development work through the RDF. You might take 138,000 out if you support the business case for process management expertise, but there or thereabouts, 3.9 million.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I wanted to nudge that. My recollection from the narrative we had at the long-term plan about the RDF and its future use, as well as from that workshop in December, I think we should start crafting a motion for having that 100,000 come from the residual RDF. I just think it's an appropriate use of that source. I just wanted to flag that now so it can be crafted. Thanks.
Councillor Smith.
I'm not sure whether you want to do it now or at some stage, but I'd just like to understand the additional management person with apparent failures, as it was outlined in the report. Just what will one person do to change what I see as part of the culture of the place? They should be doing it anyway. So what's one person going to do to actually change all around? We're in the management, each manager should be looking at the issues and why it isn't happening within their portfolios.
So
This is in relation to the business case. This is your questions in relation to the business case for the business
Yeah,
process.
it's raised now, but I can happily delay it till when you want it.
yeah,
Well, I think we need to be taken
we
through.
have that covered off in terms of Neville can talk to what's intended through that role, which is only for a year.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, we'll leave it till then, but I really do have some questions on that.
Councillor Graf.
Thanks, Madam Chair. That, in case I missed it, that 3.9 million, if it was used to offset the impact on the rates, what would that mean again on the percentage?
If that whole amount was applied to the proposed budget, that would mean an increase of 3.1%, but noting that that would have a consequence in the next financial year.
Okay.
Of potentially that would be looking if you take maths, if you take the rate revenue requirement as per the LTP and say that number doesn't change, applying 3.94 million in the current year would result in a 12.3% increase in 26-27. Now, if you take the increase in revenue between the 2 years and you apply the 3.94% this year, that would give a 6.8% increase in
So
26-27.
So just in case I didn't make the surplus from last year, the surplus 3.94 million that's sitting there.
Yep.
Now, if that was used to offset the rates.
Yep.
In this coming year, what reduction would that have on the
so that would take your 5.8% down to
3.1%.
3.1%.
Is that including the PT?
Sorry?
Was that including the PT?
Yes,
the 1.5% PT?
So that is inclusive. So that's the 5.8% increase in rates revenue from current ratepayers.
Yep.
as per all of the reports,
Yep.
if you applied your 3.9, that would
Yep.
take you down to 3.1%. Now I'm giving you the 26, 27 numbers as well, because there is a knock-on consequence to
Yep.
whatever action council takes this year, that
Mhm.
that is an unfunded portion of council's operations that you need to then fill the following year. So,
So how
and
much
any of
was
these
allocated
numbers-
to the following year?
well, effectively repaying whatever you're applying to this year, because you've got a deficit that needs to be addressed. So
If I could just help with that, councillor Graf, you get a one-off benefit
you get a
a
one-off
one-year
benefit
benefit,
and then a,
yep.
but it has
and then a one-off negative.
and it has a kick the next year.
Okay.
So it's not, unless you substantially then in the following year look at council's operations and identify $4 million of reductions, you need to raise your funding to fill that deficit that you've
Okay.
incurred through the application of the
So
surplus.
even though it's it looks like 3.9 million excess, it's actually already accounted for.
So no, we haven't. Staff, other than the items that we have flagged
Yeah.
as being drawn down from the surplus to
Yeah.
get to that 3.9 million, staff have not assumed any application of the prior year surplus in the budget that's been presented to you. So we're in councillors' hands to land what that is. I guess all I'm trying to do is advise in terms of the impact in 25, 26, but acknowledge that that has a consequence
Yep.
in the next year to that needs to be redressed.
If I could just reiterate Janine's previous advice to council. Tell me if I've got this wrong, Janine, but her advice is that any surpluses should be applied to sort of future strategic items which don't have ongoing general rate impact. That you can fund as kind of one-offs, because if you apply it to
Right,
anything
because
that's got
then
a
it
rating
comes-
impact,
It comes back to haunt you.
Yeah.
that's it.
And so that's a lot of what council did through the LTP actually, was with a number of initiatives that were of fixed duration, but were actually strategically important to set the platform moving forward. We utilised prior year surpluses to enable us to do that without that being part of our rates revenue requirement. So it's just it's a different philosophy, I guess.
Yep. And doing it in a way that, for example, if you put on your rates bill, here everyone, you've got a little a little bonus here. You're going to come back to your normal rates next year, but here's a little bonus because we had excess. It's probably minimal, is it?
But we wouldn't
There would be the
communicate it.
bonus in the first year that you might do that.
Yes.
But equally, you would have the bump up in the next year.
Yeah.
That you would
So,
need
yeah.
to have a justification around.
Yep. No, I get it. I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
Scenario. Okay. Thanks.
Councillor Nicol.
Yeah, I'm really glad we spent a bit of time understanding that so that everyone can make informed decisions on that topic. My question, Janine, is about the timing of that discussion, because as I understand it, today we are deciding what to go out to consultation with. And I know that there are people in the room who would like to or have an interest in making a decision on that surplus today, for example, to then go out and, sorry, just getting a little bit distracted. Could I? If we were to leave it as the surplus as it is for now, as we tend to always do, the option to revisit this discussion still is there in June when the final decisions gets made, right? Whereas if we made a decision now to do what we just discussed about reducing the rate that we go out in consultation with, we're effectively inviting discussion on it of what we've chosen to do with that surplus, which could still then change in June again. And secondly, in my view, would we be reducing our options in a way in June to lower the rates because we have already signalled a lower rate now, and hence through the CE submission and anything that could happen, it could go up, and we have less levers to. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, we're in your
Yeah.
hands on it, but I guess it is the balance of locking something in now,
Yeah.
and then unwinding that decision. So I guess you don't want to be in a position if you've been out and signalled a rates increase now, and then probably, if you had to go back in June with something higher,
Yeah.
unless it's been from an external issue that's that's
Which can
arrived,
happen.
which can absolutely
And has happened.
happen.
Yeah, so I think I was just wanting to clarify because I know that it has happened in the past that we've gone out with a lower number, ended up with a higher number, and that wasn't desirable.
No, unless you're really, really clear on what's actually
Exactly.
driving that.
Whereas
that
here,
increase.
we're just offering to people this is the budget that we're consulting on, and the final decisions and the most room to move we want to give ourselves in June really would be a better way to go. So I just wanted to understand that, make sure it's on track. Thanks.
Councillor Smith.
Yeah, just going to Clyde's point for a moment, the freshwater farm plan software issue was 1.9 million. I think you just put up there that we've included in using the surplus to pay for that one-off cost. So
which is reduced.
what is it there?
1.4
1.4 million. So that's about a 1% increase that would have been needed if we hadn't had that slush fund. So the don't call it a slush fund, but that surplus. So I think the fundamental question for me is, should we be looking at using that to offset rates increases, which has the kicker that you have to put it up nearly the same amount to collect what you didn't collect as a result, or should we be using it for one-off costs that are not continuous, etc., such as this freshwater farm plan cost? The difficulty I've got is that we overcharged, and it is the current ratepayer who has paid that. So it's either one or the other, or a mixture of both. And I think once we get towards the end of this, we need to actually decide whether we fundamentally give it back and then kick them next year, or we retain it for protecting ourselves against one-off costs. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
And I'm interested, Noel, when you say that we make a decision, based on what I said, would you rather make that decision when you go up for consultation or make that decision in the final? Oh. Yeah, sounded like you wanted levers. Thanks.
I'll kick them over mine.
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, my issue is that this is money that we've collected from ratepayers in excess of what we need, essentially.
Yes, but I think, and sorry, I haven't got the information in front of me, but needing to go back to Councillor Ma's question at the beginning in terms of have we corrected our budgets for that? There are, I mean, that number at the end of last year was much larger than we would typically see as this organisation. So quite unusual to be in this position. And I wouldn't expect us to find ourselves in that position again of, landing quite so favourably for the year. Unfortunately, we haven't quite landed the second quarter forecast for this year to be able to go exactly how well are we tracking on that, or are there some underlying issues there that in the current year that we need to be mindful of. But yes, this is whether it's ratepayer funding or we've had, good wins from Treasury interest rates having peaked outside of our planning cycle. But this, at the end of the day, these are general ratepayer funds that we have collected in excess of what we need to run this organisation in the last financial year.
Right. So this is much more than we normally have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So why then, if we use this year for rates reduction, why then is it a 12% rate increase the following year? And if you include the 1.5% growth in the number of ratepayers, it comes to 6%. So
No, sorry. Those numbers are looking at two different things. Because I'm trying to project forward to a budget that we have only set notionally through the LTP. So that my 2 points of reference in terms of the two numbers, I've looked at the 5.8% as per the proposed budget, where council could land today based on all of the staff recommendations, and taken the 3.9 million off that. That gets you to 3.1%. Now, off that lower base of rates for this year, I've then looked at 2 points of reference. The rates, pure rates revenue figure that was budgeted in the LTP, which was 165-ish million. The increase from this year's budget to that would be 12.3% to current ratepayers after factoring in growth. So that's the revenue comparison. My second set of numbers is same assumptions on the current year, but looking at the change in revenue that was planned in the LTP to over and above the gross 25-26. So it was a 4.2% increase in revenue after growth planned in the LTP. That only gets you to 157 million. So if you take that off, it's 6.8. So there's a lot of maths in there, and it all depends on future decisions through a future planning cycle. But the message is, if you reduce your rates through the 25-26 annual plan, then you have to, that is a deficit that you need to be funding in the following year, and that would land you somewhere between a 7 and a 12% rates increase based on the numbers as presented in the LTP.
but do we know that we won't have a surplus next year from collecting more rates than what we need, as we've done this year?
And so that's my comment, that we haven't quite managed to land the December forecast. There's still just a few moving parts on that we need to understand to have confidence in where we're sitting this year and any issues that may be impacting on us this year that, you know, need to be reflected through here.
And so could I suggest, to pick up Jen's point, if we're not making a decision on this today, it would be useful for you just to have an email setting out what you've just stated. And it's possible that we may have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million reduction rather than 3.9.
Yeah.
Because that again would have an impact.
And look, I can put, either I can share my screen a little bit later and maybe at the end of the day, because I think this is a conversation at the end of I think you need to work through all of the other matters in the budget first, and we can come back to this. And then if necessary, I can share my screen with you and talk through, hopefully my okay maths, to show what I'm looking at and how I'm calculating or estimating what the impact for the following financial year would be. I'm just trying to be cautious in my advice to you in terms of a decision for 25-26 will have an impact on 26-27.
Janine, if I just make a comment that I think will help. We haven't, when you set your budgets for this year, you haven't set them to project a surplus that you could then reflect on in a future year. So I think I understand where you're coming from. You know, could that smooth the impact further out? That isn't planned.
Although every year we do have a surplus, albeit not 6 million.
No, that's not correct.
So did we have a surplus the previous year?
Residual.
Right. Okay. I just think it would be useful if you could write something down. I like to read stuff rather than just, but thank you.
I'm also just wondering, because what I was hearing earlier is that this has been discussed through the Finance and Services Committee as well, the concern about what was the situation that led to this extraordinary surplus, this out of the norm. And and you've assured us that you've looked through those learnings and you're reflecting them going forward, right? Okay. Lamar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, Janine, noting that we haven't confirmed the write-off of those farm plan costs, can you just remind us of the interest component going forward if we don't? I was trying to find it in the pack I have.
Yeah, so I think we're budgeting about a $600,000 per annum loan repayment. So it's about 200 of interest and about 400 of principal, and obviously that'll sort of change over time as the
I just wanted to make sure councillors had their head around the fact that.
Yeah, not doing this will add that cost back into the budget, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Hughes.
Madam Chair. This is not our money. This is the actual ratepayers' money that we've taken off them. And I'd like to think that the surplus is significantly contributed to by our management team. Like, we had a budget, they didn't spend it. And I think we should give credit where credit's due, because money doesn't grow on trees, as we all know. So I would like to think that management have achieved that for last year, and hopefully the same frugal approach is being applied to the spending again this year. We won't know for some time yet, but we will know closer to the end of June if how things are tracking. So I accept that we should be deferring our decision until then, but I am strongly of the view that this money should be going back to our ratepayers in the next year, and that it should be shown as a separate line item. And in the following year, we'll have an annual plan to be considered, and some of us may or may not be here to consider it, but we'll take it on the chin then. Let the costs lie where they are, because if it costs us an extra 12% to run this organisation, then there may be a lot more scrutiny applied to the inputs into it than what have been done in the past. So I'm an absolute advocate, openness, fairness and transparency. If taken too much money off the ratepayers, give it back to them.
Councillor Clarkson.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. What proportion of the surplus relates to additional funding that was brought in from other parties that we weren't anticipating, which has an impact on the surplus?
And
I don't need that one today, but I'm just trying to make the point about, I think previously the CE and others have mentioned that we have brought in funding from other sources and on some occasions, which have an impact on what we actually end up spending from ratepayer money.
yeah, I'd probably just again clarify, this is all around the general rate, where I think some of that external funding is particularly advantageous around the targeted rates. And that those pluses and minuses are all accounted for through their different reserves. But just, yeah, I mean, we've had additional rates, penalty income and interest income, for example, on contributing, a good chunk of that $6 million. And those are numbers that we have reviewed through the annual plan budget to make sure that we've got those settings about right, for as much as we can actually predict that those numbers might be right. Yeah.
All right. Where to next?
Next slide. Oh, so external drivers. So I'm sure you'll probably hear more about this one over the duration of the conversations, but obviously the National Land Transport Program funding, a number of assumptions made in the LTP in relation to that funding, but what was announced last year was that fund includes no additional money for new or trial services. So the proposed budget reflects the removal of all of that expenditure that hasn't received NZTA subsidy. There's one item in terms of a separate report in relation to an opportunity discussed with councillors in December around fully funding with no NZTA subsidy real-time passenger information displays. So that will be covered separately when we get to transport.
Can I make a quick comment? It's just, I think in regards to that, my experience has been for the past couple of years, we've tried really hard through the Future Proof Public Transport Subcommittee and a bit, I imagine, through RTC as well, to try and line up, especially Hamilton bus services and such. And I just wanted to add the reflection that while we've done so much better in that space, I think the narrowing down in the December workshop possibly still could have been done better, because it ended up being a resolution crafted on the fly in the Future Proof Public Transport Subcommittee, which said retain local share, which isn't very specific, because we were then given about 7 or 8 bullet points of what that could go towards. And this council, who doesn't know a lot about what Hamilton City's been up to, and they've only got 2 representatives on that anyway, then narrowed it down. And so I just went to the effort of trying to understand what was the intention behind that motion that was crafted. And I learned that it wasn't just the real-time passenger display units, but in particular the rotor-turner rocket. And that's mainly because Hamilton City Council have invested money of the ratepayers' money that they've collected in new bus stops there and various things to get that ready to go, as well as central government funding they got for some of that as well. So it's this lining up of knowing where they have invested so that we do our investment. And ideally, in my view, it would have been great if the rotor-turner rocket piece had come to this discussion as well, but I totally accept that as part of the process we go through. This is where we've ended up. My reflection is just we can still do a bit better with lining up to make sure their whole council and our whole council understands how to optimise, so that I suppose all the elected members, at least of Hamilton, this council in there, have a vision for Hamilton and are really moving in lockstep. But we've done really well so far in aligning better. It's just, I think we could do a little more in future years to continue to do so. But look forward to the item when we get to it.
Yeah.
Nothing much required other than that.
Yeah.
It's a reflection.
I will fill in the top. I think there's a distinction between Hamilton City Council retaining their local share for infrastructure as a one-off cost, as opposed to this council fully funding a service that is an ongoing cost that once we take that step,
We might be locked into.
we won't,
Yeah.
our chances of getting subsidy for that will be vastly reduced, if not eliminated. So I think that's part of informing that decision making as well.
Thanks for reminding us if that's how we did land at this place. I just think it'd be great if more elected members thrash that out too, rather than kind of the way it happened this time. But yeah, thanks.
Councillor Strange.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Jen, for bringing that up. I suppose my reflections, like Janine has touched on, the risks around, funding a service and not getting that match funding moving forward, just those risks were too great in my mind. And the option was presented that, one-off infrastructure could go some way towards, signalling that we are,
Committed.
we value the relationship with Hamilton City and we are committed towards that goal. I suppose for me, the real disappointment was that through the NLTF, that the rotor-turner rocket wasn't funded, because that would have brought so many benefits that this current government is looking for: bums on seats, fare box recovery, because we know that that kind of service is what we need moving forward. So that was the greatest disappointment for me. But yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Thanks for adding that, Angela.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Out of here shortly, I promise. So this is another topic that covered by a separate report, but obviously in relation to the central government or NZTA discussion document around increasing private share for public transport operating expenditure. Paper included in the agenda in terms of increases to public transport fares for consideration by council. So we'll cover that one off in due course. And then finally, just a point in terms of a recap on the business cases that were the basis of new investment into the 24-34 LTP. The team have gone through and done a little bit of a sort of status check of how we're progressing with those, and so that information is included as an appendix in the report as well. So if you want to recap on what the areas of new investment were set out in there. So that's me. I think we move now into the different groups of activities.
So I think we'll take a break at this point. So we will adjourn. It is 10:53. We'll adjourn now and let's get back 11:05.